The Philosopher's Stone and Personal Alchemy. Welcome. Big welcome. In late November, Luckman, one of my subscribers to this channel, came to visit me in my mountain home. He was interested in my tarot reading. I mean, his real interest is astronomy, but I don't know so much about astronomy. So I could talk to him about tarot. But I think he was really interested in my understanding of Kejauhan, particularly my understanding of Kejauhan, because it baffles Indonesians because I'm a foreigner. So yes, he's Indonesian. He's a young man from Jogja or Yogyakarta. And he'd previously worked in software development for parts of the Indonesian government. And now, as he was leaving me, he made a profound comment. And the more I thought about it, the more profound it was. And I wish to explore this comment in this vlog. And that comment was that in object-orientated programming, the human being has become just another object. The Enlightenment. Let me be clear, it's not my intention to diminish the contributions of the Enlightenment and technology to humanity. Not least as if I were to. I know the sort of posts I would get for doing so. However, I would question if all of these developments are as massive as they are claimed. You see, we tend to see such developments through the veneer, or hegemony if you like, of the Enlightenment itself. So for example, I've always argued that any development, including economic development, implies winners and losers. And all too often the winners are the rich and the losers are the poor. So if you think of the British Industrial Revolution, well, it was made possible by the Enclosures Act, which saw common land grabbed by wealthy landlords, forcing the poor off the land and into industrialising cities, and therefore into the factories. In fact, as I think about it, the Enlightenment brought about some sort of grand pyramid scheme, both in the economy and civilization, which is now beginning to collapse. Because, of course, it necessitates continuous growth in order to pay off the previous generation. So the Enlightenment brought about a mechanistic view of the world, seeing so many of God's creations as following the same laws as as machines. And of course it is this very concept that has brought so many of the benefits of the Enlightenment. I'm not arguing against it. And initially this sort of mechanistic approach was most apparent in man's relationship with so-called inanimate objects and with animals. But increasingly we're beginning to understand that it's how we've destroyed our environment, destroyed the bounty of God. And this has developed now to include in man himself. So I go back to Luckman's passing comment. In object-orientated programming, the human being has become just another object. So science and logic became our dominant ideology. And it was this that led Nietzsche's misunderstood statement that God is dead. And even more misinterpreted statement by John Lennon that the Beatles were now more popular than Jesus. Indeed, within a religion, a literal, even legalistic interpretations of the scriptures was a product of the Enlightenment. So in Christianity we call it Protestantism. We don't tend to call them Protestants in Islam, but it's exactly the same thing that came from the Enlightenment and had this legalistic, even literal interpretations of the scriptures. Implied within the Enlightenment is a notion of progress, that the practices and the beliefs of the past were somehow morally abhorrent and primitive. And don't get me wrong, some of them were. But again, we're seeing it through the veneer or hegemony of the Enlightenment. A belief that we would continue to benefit from uninterrupted progress. And this is a view that's still widely held, despite seemingly increasingly unfounded and undermined. My pyramid scheme. So magic is defined as a set of primitive beliefs. Astrology, a primitive form of astronomy, and alchemy, a primitive form of chemistry. Now, despite this, one of the founders of the Enlightenment, Sir Isaac Newton, actually published far more books on alchemy than he ever did on science. Carl Jung and alchemy. Carl Jung argues for, if you like, a re-evaluation of the symbolism of alchemy as being intimately related to the psychoanalytical process. Using a cycle of dreams of one of his patients, he shows how the symbols used by alchemists occur in our psyche as a part of a reservoir of mythological images drawn upon by the individual in their dream state. Jung draws an analogy between the great works of the alchemists and the process of reintegration and individualization of the psyche in the modern psychiatric patient. So for Jung, the philosopher's stone was not about the transmutation of lead into gold, but our own reintegration of the self. Of course, many argue against Jung's interpretation, but they do so from this literalist perspective, denying the use of allegory. And this led me to consider how I get into so many arguments on this platform with literalists about religion, refusing to accept the scriptures as metaphors, but also maybe that personal alchemy holds the key to interpreting these very scriptures and therefore the knowledge of our ancestors. Magic and religion. Now, I'm lumping together magic and religion, despite the fact that religions throughout the ages have sought to establish a monopoly on own magic by claiming that magic is somehow satanic, whilst the religious ritual are themselves somehow divine because they're done in the name of God. But of course this is just another tribalism, because it's only one step away from saying ours is the only religion, the only path. Therefore such claims seem to be asserting a monopoly of how we should engage with God and indeed with fellow humans. Now, I could include science in this argument here, but it doesn't fit directly into some of my next observations. However, maybe it does within the conclusions. So religions depend on notions of the devil, Satan, Iblis, heaven and hell to justify their critique of magic. But if these are also allegorical, then maybe they're not. Then maybe they're more about how we conduct ourselves in life as much as magic per se. In other words, it could be more about the abuse of power and greed than the misuse of magic. Although, of course, magic can be misused for power and greed, and I'd include it in the abuse of power and greed, but not define it separately. So I'm increasingly seeing the scriptures as allegories about human psychology. Now, if I'm correct that we co-create our environment from our beliefs, then human psychology really does provide the key to unlocking the wonders of the universe. Indeed, so many of the stories in the scriptures appear to be allegories on personality traits. You might even call them Jungian archetypes. For example, I previously argued that the 99 divine names of Allah are exactly this. But then the same would be true for elements of magic. Taking tarot cards, for example, and the Rider-Waite deck in particular, the cards also appear to refer to psychological traits or Jungian archetypes. But tarot introduces the idea of life cycles, and that we are here to learn from these cycles. Within these cycles, we constantly shift from left brain to right brain, from conscious to unconscious. But then on reflection, however, so do the scriptures. Whilst learning to prevent a cycle repeating itself is absolutely implicit in the teachings of the Buddha. Magic in an alchemy. In Kajawan, we see the lower veils of Kajawan, which would include the practice of magic as a life stage through which we must pass to become closer to God. So in other words, there are 7 veils in Kajawan, and the higher veils are, if you like, Buddhism or Sufism, and the lower veils are practical magic, if you like. So at its simplest, this is abusing magic for one's own personal gain. But even what is called white magic is an attempt to exert control over the environment. Even a belief that one's personal beliefs and will are superior to those of others. So using my allegorical interpretation of the scriptures, then our goal is to suppress our own ego. Now, Jungians would not agree with me with this description and see it as being a reintegration of the self. And this isn't simply semantics. I'm not trying to say that it's just a semantical difference. It isn't. But it doesn't detract from my argument, and that's the important point, because the suppressing the ego brings us closer to God, or the integration of the self. So maybe magic is a diversion. A necessary diversion, yes, but in suppressing the ego to get closer to God. So that's the very reason why we have magic in Kajawan, because of it's a diversion. But unless you've explored this diversion, at least in your mind, then you're not going to move closer to God. So magic is necessary to this aspect of my religion. Life cycles and obstacles. So, like magic, there appears to be so many obstacles which prevent us from suppressing the ego, and therefore becoming closer to God, which, if not just the Buddhist, but the many religions, or many parts of religions, would see this as our ultimate goal, the meaning of life, if you like. And so obstacles are sent to prevent us from doing this. Greed and the desire to control that I've hinted at are obvious ones. And certainly I talk about social media a lot and how it feeds on narcissism and therefore the ego. And I've discussed this many times. But what of religion itself? Especially those who insist on a literal interpretation of the scriptures. For me, Shams al-Marif is a holy book because it contains this personal alchemy that allows us to get closer to God. So those who insist on a literal interpretation, not only of Al-Quran, but of Shams al-Marif, are actually doing the very same as those people who express greed and control the social media. They're preventing us from getting closer to God. However, I think what I'd like to argue is maybe the most permissive obstacle to us achieve, well, I won't say a oneness with God, Some might see it that way, but certainly getting closer to God is science itself and the assumptions of the Enlightenment. For how can we suppress the ego if we deify individualism? If we believe we are all individuals, we're all separate, with separate feelings, separate desires, separate needs, then we can never suppress the ego. Why is this all happening? Well, of course, it's very tempting to invent an evil cabal, to see it in terms of us and them, to see it in terms of those who are awake and those who are asleep. But this is just tribalism again, isn't it? It only is reasserting the ego, setting us up, competition between different tribes, and therefore pulling us back from realizing a greater unity of God. And maybe this is the real contribution of religion and magic, as it suggests, admittedly allegorically, that such things are natural. In other words, we don't need to invent a cabal, because it tells us about the psychology of people, and therefore we can begin to understand that this is the way things are. We can't actually change them. We can't change them, despite me having tried to for so many years, and tried in a very nice way, through prayer. Furthermore, if we can accept what God, the universe, nature, has planned for us, and for others, and for the world, if you like, then we can actually get closer to God himself. Now, I use the word himself because I'm a Muslim, and it isn't sexism, to do with sexism. It's to do with the translation of the word Allah. So I'm quite happy to use her or even it for God's name. And a true Muslim would also say the same. So in other words, we should submit rather than seek to control God's creation. Well, I hope you've got something from this. I dare say it's challenged many of you, but I hope you understand I've tried to be firm. Yes, some is conjecture, but I have tried to base this on what I can glean as being facts, and I've tried to be fair in presenting them. It's a part of the real magic of Java, which originally I thought would show rituals in Java and would only be cut every 2 or 3 months. But what I decided to do was expand the concept to talk about things of interest. So now it's happening every 2 or 3 days. So if you have enjoyed this, or at least got something from it, if you can pass a comment and hit the like button, and if you've really enjoyed it, if you could subscribe to my channel, hit the bell and you'll get future notifications. And what I want to do is thank you so much in anticipation for that.